day 3 of the Belgrade Security Forum. I apologize for this slight delay. It's very nice to see that there are quite a few of you still with us, in spite of the weekend beginning. It's always hard to work on a weekend, but I think we're all very committed to partaking in this event. My name is István Vejvoda. I'm the Vice President of the German Marshall Fund, a Belgrader. I'm very happy that we have a very distinguished panel this morning to talk about the consequences of the crisis on human security at home and abroad. I think we have the exact right lineup to address these issues. From my left, I'll very briefly introduce the panel because you have their biographies in the documents of the conference. To my immediate left is Professor Mary Kaldor from the London School of Economics. I know it's not called the Center for Global Civil Society anymore.
It is.
It is still
it's called the Civil Society and Human Security Research Unit.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Next is Dr. István Gyarmati from Budapest, and who has been instrumental in many of the steps that Hungary has made towards Euro-Atlantic accession, is a prominent figure in civil society and the Hungarian public and internationally, and who has worked internationally also in New York with the East-West Institute prior to returning back home. Next is Ramsey Lanham, known to many of you in the region. He's been a regional actor with one of the most credible voices coming out of Albania, and been someone who's worked very hard to strengthen regional networks, in particular in the media world. He runs the Media Institute there. And last but not least, we have Mr. Radwan Ziadeh, who is from the Syrian Center for Political and Strategic Studies. Welcome to all. Unfortunately, those who we were all expecting, my colleague Constanze Stelzenmüller, she fell ill. Fortunately, nothing serious, and could not make it to the conference. So without further ado, I'll ask Mary to kick us off.
Well, first of all, it's very nice to be here, and many thanks to Sonia and others for inviting me and making it so nice, and to be back in Belgrade. So I'm going to make a few very brief points. First of all, I think the big problem of the economic crisis is that it has magnified what I call the security gap. And the security gap is the fact that many people in the world feel deeply insecure, either for economic reasons or because they're faced with violence. And our security capabilities largely consist of military forces which not only don't make them feel more secure, on the contrary, they make them feel more insecure. And it seems the big problem at the moment is that people's insecurity is greatly increasing with the impact of the economic crisis. And far from developing appropriate capabilities to deal with people's insecurity, governments are going in the opposite direction. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point is, what do I mean by human security, and what would human security capabilities mean? Well, human security, everyone agrees, is about the security of the individual rather than about the state. And usually people go on to say it's about the link between economic and physical insecurity. It's not only about violence, it's also about being free from concerns about poverty and homelessness. I add always a third element. Human security is what we expect in well-ordered societies governed by a rule of law. And we used to traditionally think of the rule of law as something that we maintained at home, and abroad was the area of war. I think in an era of globalization, what human security is really about is extending the rule of law. So for me, that's crucial. And what does that then mean about human security capabilities? Well, it means that they have to be much more like police than like the military. And over the last 2 decades, in many countries, there's been a huge learning process, not least because of the wars in this part of the world. And there have been developments, many armed forces use the term human security. The European Union external policy is very much shaped by human security. Sonia and I were part of a team that were helping Javier Solana develop the ideas. And they involve a sort of mixture of military and civilian policing. I won't go into detail because of my 7 minutes, but what has happened under the impact of the crisis is that governments have to cut defense spending, and what they protect are their old-fashioned military capabilities, which they regard as the core capabilities. This is particularly serious in Britain, France, but also in the United States, where instead of developing this kind of thing, they're focusing on drones, for example. So my second point is really that we're going backwards in terms of security capabilities in a way that is quite dangerous. The third point is, I think the current situation is very dangerous. I don't want to go into great detail about it, but what I would say is that if the European Union cannot solve the euro crisis, we face a kind of Balkanization of Europe. And what I mean by that is a situation rather similar to the situation you had in this part of the world. I don't imagine another world war, but what I do imagine is a mixture of low-level ethno-nationalist violence and criminality. And I think, I'm very happy we have someone from Syria. I think the situation in Syria is truly alarming and very dangerous and could become a much greater confrontation if you add in the elements of Israel and Iran, and that also will have an impact on Europe. So actually we need to rethink security very quickly if we're going to get through this dangerous crisis. So my next point is, how do we get through the dangerous crisis? I don't have time to go into detail, but what I would say is I think the European Union has to get its act together. It has to have a political union and a fiscal union. But that doesn't mean the European Union becomes a new nation state. My view is the European Union has to be a new model of global governance. It has to be a way of protecting democracy at local levels from the ills of globalization, like financial speculation or climate change, and a way of contributing to global goods, one of which is human security. And so actually I think for the European Union to develop more of a human security is not only important in terms of actually what's happening within Europe, but also in terms of gaining support for a new kind of political union. So finally, and this is where I'll end, how can we reach that? And I think the big problem today is politics. I think what's going on at the moment is actually not so much an economic crisis as a political crisis. The demonstrators in Occupy, we just completed a study of what we called subterranean politics in Europe. And what was clear was that what people were demonstrating against, including in Germany, was not austerity, but a huge frustration with the political elite. That what they wanted, as the Spanish put it, was real democracy now. So I think there's a big political problem, but at the same time, those people in the street are not asking for a new European Union. All the new initiatives for Europe come from elite level. They come from intellectuals, they come from NGOs. If you go and talk to people in the squares or people in new parties, mostly they're Eurosceptical. The idea of Europe as a model of peace and democracy is something that our generation believe in, but the younger generations see Europe as a neoliberal bureaucracy. And they've had years of having politicians blame all their problems on Europe. So there's a huge gap, and it's not just a gap about Europe, it's a gap about institutions, because in a way, there's no middle generation that's capable of taking the demands of the people in the squares into institutions. The same problem is true in the Middle East, What I think is 2011 is more like 1968 than 1989. I think 1989 was the 68 generation coming to maturity. 2011 is a new generation that might have the capacity to solve things in 20 years' time, but actually we need them to start to solve things now. So I'm ending on a very pessimistic note.
Well, thank you very much, Mary, for really throwing out a lot of very deep and serious questions that I'm sure we'll discuss as we go into the questions and answers session. In particular, this last one about politics, which of course touches upon all of our societies. István, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I can tell you a secret to start with. We have a years-long competition with Sonja Licht, and we compete who can be more politically incorrect. So I will try to win this competition this morning, Sonja, if you agree. And basically continue where Mary stopped. Not finished, but stopped. She stopped on a pessimistic note, which shows her Hungarian roots. But I'm fully Hungarian, so I promise to be even more pessimistic. Anyway, so I have a question to the subject of this meeting, of this panel, actually. We are talking about the impact of the crisis, but Mary already started elaborating on this. What kind of a crisis? What kind of a crisis do we have? Are we in? Is it an economic crisis? Is it a European crisis? Or is it much more than that? And I'm even more pessimistic because I think it's not a simple economic crisis, nor is it a simple political crisis. I think the roots are much deeper. The economic crisis is present in Europe and to some extent in the United States. The world economy is not in a similar crisis. Or if there are signs of a crisis like the GDP slowdown in China, the reasons for that are totally different from our reasons. It looks similar, but it is not similar. And when we are talking about how to solve the problems caused by the crisis, we are falling back into our 19th, 20th century thinking, that we think Europe is in a crisis, this means the world is in a crisis. First of all, it's not true. Secondly, Europe is not the center of gravity anymore. And this is one part of the crisis, that we are not able to digest this change, that Europe, we are not the center of gravity. We do not determine where the world goes anymore alone. And our role is getting more and more limited. And I think the choice Europe has, just to start, not only to finish on a pessimistic note, the choice Europe has is not to regain its old role in the world. The choice is where and how our decline ends, because we are in decline. How it ends. Does it end like the Roman Empire in collapse and in the dark Middle Ages? Or can we secure a smooth landing? But before we admit that we are in decline, and therefore we try to achieve something that is not achievable, which is restoring the glory of Europe, we are heading for the collapse, because we are not choosing the lesser evil, because we think there is still a good outcome. I tell you, there is none. Why? And I think in this respect, the economic crisis, the euro crisis, the EU crisis is much more the symptoms and not the reasons for an overall crisis. What is the overall crisis? I think the overall crisis is a crisis of liberal democracy as we've known it for many decades. I would be the last to question that that's the best form of government. I'm even more enthusiastic for democracy than Winston Churchill, so I think it's not only the best form of government because all the others are worse, but I think it's a good form of government, provided it's exercised right. And I think that's what doesn't happen in European countries. The people, again, I'm getting back to Mary, the people are alienated from the system. They don't feel they live in a democracy. We have the institutions, but they don't feel that these democratic institutions serve their best interests as they conceive it. The second problem I see is that it looks like, I'm not sure it is true, but it looks like I don't know what the competition between Sonja Licht and me, how it will end, if ever, but the competition between Fukuyama and Huntington is coming to a solution, and Huntington is right, or getting right. I don't want to admit this, but the world looks like we don't live in an end of history, everybody is becoming democratic, but much more in a clash of civilizations. But there is an internal crisis also of democracy, not only that the people are alienated, but now we get to a natural situation where there are more and more countries which claim or are democratic. Some of them claim to be, some of them are. But there are very different forms of democracy. And these different forms differ in such a way that we are confused, and the people are also confused. We try to push to promote our own model, although we always pay lip service to not doing it, but we do that. We think that's the only one. And many countries or societies rather, it's not the countries, but many societies who want to be democratic, but they don't want to be democratic like us. They would observe the basic principles of democracy, by the way, who can determine what are the basic principles of democracy. But let's insist on Kissinger's approach that he said about pornography. I say about democracy, I can't define it, but I recognize it when I see it. But now the interesting phenomenon is that the dividing line in most cases, most extremely crucial cases, is not between democracies and dictatorships, but it's also within democracies. If you take the crucial issue of Iran, whatever you think of Iran, whether you think that Iran is a nice country or whether you think Iran is an aggressor already who should be destroyed, you see that the dividing line on how to deal with Iran, with the problem, divides democracies. It's not only Russia, China on one side and us on the other side. Some of us are on one side, but India is on the other side. The biggest democracy in the world is on the other side. Brazil is on the other side, siding with China and Russia. And our allies are Saudi Arabia, which is, if I would have to choose where to live in Iran or Saudi Arabia, I would go to Iran. Maybe not now because of the possible strike, but as a society, I think it's a much more developed society. So we have a crisis of democracies and of democracy. And of course, many countries call themselves democratic. Now, what is the difference between different democracies and genuine democracies and those who call themselves democratic? It's very difficult to determine. What is the impact? The impact is, and I think, again, Mary is right, that people are much more annoyed by feeling insecure than about austerity. Austerity can be understood by most people. But not knowing not only the future, what the future brings, but not knowing what happens today, not understanding. And our political elites and governments are extremely bad in explaining this. The best example is the European Union. For the last 20 years, we always blamed everything on Brussels. We do the bad things because Brussels wants us, and we do the nice things because we have good politicians. And now we are surprised that people don't like Brussels. So there are also other reasons. And my last point is that you may call it a crisis, but we live in a time where the changes in the world are revolutionary. I think the changes which can be probably somehow, if you need a starting date, as for the Westphalian regime, you say that the Treaty of Westphalia was the starting date. I think it's September 11th, that's the starting date of the development of a new era. But it's only 11 years ago. And we don't know the impact of what the post-Westphalian word is. We don't even know a word, that's why we say post-Westphalian. The only thing we know, it's not Westphalian. It's after Westphalian. But this word is globalized, which means that the usual history cannot be repeated, that every country lives and every society her own life and goes through an organic development over 200 years. And secondly, it means that we have pre-modern, modern, and postmodern states, but the general expectation, the values that we cherish, and we think everybody does, it's not true, are those of the modern and postmodern societies. But the early modern societies and the pre-modern societies do not share these values because they are not fully developed yet. And if you take the legislation which was in force in Great Britain, if I may use this, Mary, under Henry VIII, and compare it to Sharia, you will discover that there is not too much difference, which means that it might not be probably the religion, but the level of development of the society and the economy that determines, for instance, where the values are. Now, when Henry VIII lived in Britain, of course, there were other countries which were less developed, but they didn't know about it. They just lived together. Now we know about it. We are under tremendous pressure when people see on TV that somebody is beheaded in Saudi Arabia to do something about it. We have a developed political elite in those countries which follows our values, but it's basically out of place in places. It's an isolated small elite, but it's loud, and they say what we like to hear, so we think they represent the society, why they don't. So I think it's a dilemma. What is the solution? There is no solution. There is no solution for the next decades. We got used in the Cold War that the world was organized. We had NATO and Warsaw Treaty. If you really wanted to solve problems, you brought together the Soviets and the Americans, and they solved the problems. Now you can't do this. But if you look back in history, that was an exception. Except the 2 decades after the Holy Alliance in 1815, there was no similar situation in the world. So a chaotic world is much more the practice in history than an organized world. But we got used to the organized world, and people like to be organized, whatever way. So we are trying to organize the world, but it's not possible, and therefore we fail all the time. We will fail this time too. It doesn't mean that we should not try to organize our own countries, because if you have a country which is organized, which is capable of addressing the problems and even solving problems, you can much better sail in this storm. But the storm will not go away. I mean, you can wish, when you are in a ship in the middle of the Atlantic in a storm, you can wish the storm away, but it will not go away. So you have to prepare your ship and yourself to live through the storm for a few decades. Thank you.
István, thank you very much. That's
pessimistic?
You were definitely, if not more pessimistic, more realistic. The flip side, of course, being that human beings have always, even in the most adverse conditions, fought for their freedom and dignity, sometimes with success, sometimes not. And of course, what is termed as the Arab Spring is one of those phenomena in our day and age when people rise to protect that dignity and freedom. Of course, it's one thing to rise, it's another thing to actually implement the rules under which dignity and freedom can be preserved. But again, that's an issue for discussion. Remzi, it's your turn now.
Thank you, Ivan. I come from Tirana, but I will start with a joke from Sarajevo, a recent joke from Sarajevo. A foreign expert goes to Sarajevo and asks an ordinary Bosnian citizen, what you can tell me about the impact of global financial crisis in Bosnia? And the Bosnian guy responded, come on, nothing can succeed in Bosnia, even the crisis. But despite this cynicism, crises have succeeded. Has succeeded not only in Bosnia, but in all the region, including Albania, my country, which until now has been less affected, actually. A few months ago, during the Sofia Forum, we have been debating if the region is better or worse, in a better or worse situation than before, and countries are in better or worse situation than before, and different opinions were expressed. I believe we have a paradox in the Balkans today. Countries are in a worse situation and the region is in a better situation. Individual countries are in a worse situation, let's say, compared to 5 years ago. Democracy has been stagnating. We live in illiberal stabilocracies. And economy is seriously affected by the crisis. And there are figures and data from all our countries on this. But the region is in a better situation compared to 5 years ago because interstate relations have improved, countries behave with more responsibility towards each other, NATO has new members from the region, and peace is seen as the only alternative in all capitals. How long this paradox can last is another question. It's a different question. What I wanted to stress is that at these times of crisis, more than regional security, more than national security, under the threat is human security. People are losing jobs. Dimitar Bechev was talking for a crisis unemployment in his recent paper. Greek crisis is affecting all our countries, and Albania first of all, very fast. For example, remittances are decreasing 7 to 8% each year, and they are very important for Albanian families who are very much dependent on remittances, especially pensioners. And the process of reverse migration is evident, with more than 50,000 emigrants returning home only last year in Albania and looking for a job, and they cannot find a job. And the crime in Albania, for the first time in a decade, is becoming a serious threat. It was not an issue, now it's a very hot issue. I would like to refer to a poll of the Albanian Institute for International Studies last year, around 20 years after the fall of communism. And there are some interesting data. 100% of respondents said that there is more freedom of expression now than 20 years ago. That's clear. Around 50% say that there is a better education now than 20 years ago. And only 30% say that there is a better health system now than 20 years ago. In a way, we can say that what Mary calls freedom from fear is something of the past, but freedom from want, not. Without going to the theory, economic security is under threat, environmental security seems to be a luxury, health security is problematic. But crisis is only one of the arguments. The other argument is the weak states we live. Weak states are states that cannot provide to the citizen the basic things or services that a normal state has to provide: security, education, health, etc. I am mentioning this because I am afraid that the crisis can be used as an alibi also for things that are not related necessarily with the crisis. For example, Roma situation. I don't think that their situation now can be explained with the present crisis. It was bad before, and it's worse now. Why? They have been ignored, marginalized, forgotten even before the crisis. And as a journalist, I can say that I use the term hate speech and hate silence. And Roma, in some countries, is a victim of hate speech, and some countries, like my country, is a victim of hate silence. We don't attack them in the press, we simply don't talk about them, they don't exist. And hate is expressed sometimes by speech and sometimes by lack of speech or silence. The good thing about the crisis, being a bit cynical, is that the crisis is gradually changing our discourse. For 20 years, we in the civil society circles have been talking mostly for the democracy. Now we start talking also for capitalism. Discourse has been always freedom of expression, human rights, political rights, but really not much on social rights and not much on consequences of wild capitalism that we have in most of our countries. Carlos Fuentes, the Mexican writer who died last year, used to say that I was against yesterday's communism without freedom, and I am against today's capitalism without justice. I like very much this expression. What kind of capitalism we are building? Who are the winners and who are the losers? 5% of Albanians, to give you a figure, possess 60% of the deposits in Albanian banks. One word about the youth. I will give another figure. There are 25,000 students, including my daughter, studying abroad today. For a country with 2.8 million people, it's a serious figure. And how many of them return? Less than 10%. Why? Simply because they feel detached from the state and from the country they come. And there is a vacuum to be filled always, and this vacuum is filled by populists, by old-fashioned populists and new-fashioned populists, by populists which use actually cards spent in other countries but not spent in Albania, but also by populists who are quite, let's say, following the European trend. We have in Albania the Red and Black Alliance, which started as a nationalistic movement, mobilizing the youth mostly, and a kind of stadium type of nationalism, stadium nationalism, football nationalism, and shifting to anti-politics, following the trend of Germany or Beppe Grillo in Italy, which means against everyone, against all political class, against the establishment. So, in a way, they have an anti-Greek and anti-Serb discourse in one hand, and then an anti-politics discourse on the other hand. And we have to, I think, to keep in mind that without the human security, I'm not saying something new and something that you don't know, but without the human security, we might see also the traditional security threatened. This is why I will stop quoting our good friend Carl Bildt, that in Sofia said that it's time in the Balkans to focus less on the history of the past and more on the economy of the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramsey, for that deep insight and portrait of if one could say, a case study of the topic that we're tackling. As I said, last but not least, we go to a country where probably security is really not the word to use. It's a terrible human tragedy that is going on in the country where Ziadeh comes from. So please take the floor. And
thank you, István, and thank you for organizers for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. I try to touch the subject from personal story, where I just back from Syria last week, and I can share with you my findings for my first trip to my own country after 5 years being in exile. I left Syria first time in September 2007, where the Syrian government after that issued an arrest warrant for me and banned my sister, mother, the whole family members from leaving the country. I did not see any of them since I left in 2007. Last week, because most of the northern part of Syria and all the cross borders along with Turkey being liberated by the Free Syrian Army, now it's very easy now just cross the border from Turkey and you can go to Syria and visit there freely, which it's very amazing how you see the country after 5 years. Of course, there is no any signs of changing in economic development, but you can touch with the tragedy in the country right now. because of the bombarding of each city by the Assad security forces and the Air Force. I visited I'zaz. This is a city, the population almost 65,000. Only 35,000 they returned to their own city. The hospital there being bombarded, out of service. The 6 schools, elementary and secondary schools, bombarded, nothing there. Even that the culture center being attacked, out of service. Of course, there is no schools. There is nothing there. And the most worse, of course, how the Assad regime used the worship places. When they got inside the city in February 2012, they used the main mosque as the military base for the Syrian security forces. And they used the 2 minarets, which they have the high point, as the points of the snipers. The snipers make the most tragic scene in each city, because the snipers has green light to attack anyone they see in the street, or even that if they turn the light inside their apartments, and the snipers has to attack them because there is something there. And this is why it was very difficult, even that for the people to live there. Of course, during that, all of the population of I'zaz, they left Syria to Turkey. And then the people, they decided, and I met with all the members of the Free Syrian Army and their leader to think about that, because it's the human tragedy of that, which is very difficult how among 112 has been killed in I'zaz, only 12 members in the Free Syrian Army. Almost 100 people that have been killed there, individuals, are civilians. It was a very strong fight, almost for 5 to 6 months. 17 tanks has been destroyed in the city, but at the end, the Free Syrian Army was able. Of course, because they got the support from the whole the population, and everyone asking about the nature of the Free Syrian Army. The Free Syrian Army is the sons of each city. Every individual has brother been killed, daughter has been raped, or a mother has been killed, decided just to join the Free Syrian Army to defend themselves. In some cases, like in I'zaz, in other cities, they much luck when they have a leader who will be able to organize themselves in much better way. In some areas where in Homs, as example, or in Damascus suburb, there is no such sense of leaders who can be able to mobilize the all individuals who joined the Free Syrian Army. But in I'zaz, it was lucky to have individual who has just a store dealer. It's nothing. Was enabled to take some trainings and to organize the resistance against the security forces. The success story after the liberation of I'zaz, where actually the Free Syrian Army, they kept the council, even that the Ba'athi members who are members in the governing council, they kept them to keep the city running, especially the electricity, water, and all of that. Only the Shabiha, it's the death squads or the militia, very broad the government, and this most of members of those Shabiha belong to the Alawite sects, and those who are doing the most atrocities, especially the slaughtering of the children. It was a way to deepen the sectarian crisis in the country. And I surprised when you see in a lot of graffitis in the walls of the schools and about slogans against the sectarianism. I mean, most of the people, they want to live in peace, and they see that the Assad regime trying to, when they arm different specific sect from the country against the population, of course, there is high possibility to get inside very deep in sectarian crisis, Well, this is most of the Syrian, they are fear. But with the same time, you see the people, they are very aware about that, rejecting any sectarian slogans and trying to work with each other. They join a council and they elected democratically local governing council, and this one is now taking care of the people, especially electricity, water, and that's those local council. They need an urgent support and help, because there is nothing in the city. Even that, there is no hospital, there is no ambulances, cars. When I met the people, always they complaining about there is the Assad regime, as you maybe some of you read in the Human Rights Watch reports, and Amnesty used to target the bakery stores, where the people in long lines been attacked because they are waiting to get the bread. And this is, of course, none of those working in the city. And they asked me if they can help them just to keep these bakeries back to service, because they need to live, not to rely on the assistance coming from the side of Turkey. It's a mix of the feelings. You feel that the people, they excited that all their own city has been liberated, but at the same time they feel insecure because the threat of the air force of the Assad regime. After the liberation of the city of Azaz, just 2 weeks later, a city been bombarded and left 81 has been killed. And I have some pictures from there where 16 houses has been collapsed and 161 injured. When we say injured, and maybe some of you are aware of such kind of wars, that's mean many tens of people, they lost their arms, their legs, and of course that's a human tragedy for the future, for the next future. And this is why I met one of the doctors. He said to me that he did a surgical medical operation where he cut 21 arms. It's very tragedy for those individuals. How can they live in the future? What kind of the assistance they can get in the future? This is why everyone is feeling that's been, even that there is no security forces, there is no Syrian army in the city, but they feel insecure because still targeted by the air force of the Assad regime. And asking why the international community implemented the no-fly zone in Libya, where al-Qaddafi only threatening using of the air force. Now we will see that the use of the air force and left 100 of casualties every day by day, with the international community was unable to impose the no-fly zone, which became a must for even that for the population, for the civilians. And the last report of the Amnesty International shows about the cost on individual and especially on the civilians. We can see right now 90 or 95 of the casualties or the victims right now are civilians. One of the stories, it's not touched base, still in the media, it's the boxes now the Assad regime is using. It's because the Assad regime running out of missiles or rockets to bombard the city, they use the boxes which never been used in other places. It's a huge box and put it full of TNT. It's explosion for explosion. And inside the box put a lot of small bases of irons. And use, of course, the Sukhoi and MiG-21, 23. This is, of course, Russian fighter jets being used every day, day by day. And when this box is being, you know, that the fighter jets, this is very speed fighter jets, which never been used, of course, in civilians areas, because has no targets on the ground. And the Assad now his battle with the civilians, with all the population. and use these boxes when dropped down and has a huge explosion, has no targets whatsoever, no Free Syrian Army or any tanks or troops, just attacks of the civilians. I met a family where lost 17 members just because this is small pieces of irons which can explode in it. And you see that the hole that this explosion lifted. With all these personal stories about the tragedy or the impact of this prolonged fight with the Assad regime against the civilians. With the same time, that's, of course, in the media always talking about the civil war. What we have in Syria is not a civil war, because we don't have two sects or we don't have two groups that are fighting each other. What we have exactly in the political science term is a mafia state. When we have a mafia, it can hijack a state and use the human sources and the sources of the whole state to attack the whole population. Because the Assad regime used his network, his loyalists, to put them in the key figures in the security and in the army. This is why what we have the whole national army, which is very important for any state, has been divided. And all the people who are joined the Free Syrian Army, who are defect from the Assad regime or from the Assad army, because they refuse to open the instructions to open the fire on the population, on the civilians. And those join the Free Syrian Army. Then the whole state, especially the army, has been collapsed and divided. Because the Assad regime used, especially bombarding the cities, that's allow even that the civilians who are undecided to join the Free Syrian Army, push them a little by little by little to join the Free Syrian Army. Well, this is the case of Aleppo. Aleppo for almost 10 months is very loyal. There is no demonstrations because the fear, because the huge presence of the security forces, security agents. When the Assad regime start bombarding the city, everyone see, okay, we have to find a way to defend ourselves. And this is why it's little by little being pushed, the population, to join the Free Syrian Army, to join the rebel groups, etc., etc. Well, this became the case. And you have increasing strength of the Free Syrian Army. With the same time, the Assad has running out of human sources. Now the Assad became just a mayor of Damascus because he's only control of Damascus and other areas surrounded them. And all other areas, especially in northern part, in the southern part, it's out of control. But the prices of that, of course, still the use of the Air Force, which, of course, very difficult. With the same time, we know that when every dictator in his last days or became more aggressive against the population. And we saw that in many places, especially in Libya and in Gaddafi. And this is what can give us some explanation about the atrocities and massacres been taking place in every area. I'm born and raised in a city called Daraya, which is 7 kilometers from Damascus, where the bloodiest massacre happened there in just last month. 637 has been killed in one single day. I was very lucky where my mother and my sister, who's still living in the city in Daraya, I was just 3 days ago was able to smuggle them to Turkey, where for first time for almost 5 years I met with my sister, my mother, and she's telling me horrible stories you never can expect. We live from massacre in the city. Of course, I lost my cousin there. I lost my uncle. Just took them, and next day they found they're being executed, like 156 in one basement. They found them there. But what's my mother telling me a story, how 6 of my cousins, when the security and the shabiha, they got inside the building, there's no place to go because everything it's surrounded by the security. They got inside the escalator for 48 hours. There is no water, there is no food, just to keep them, because this is the safest place in the escalator until the security left. They will be able. I mean, this is horrible stories, which of course can exist in the memory for a long time in the future, which will become much more difficult in the future. How you able to overcome all of these tragic stories to build a democratic state again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Radwan, for bringing that first-hand experience of your visit to your home country and the concrete examples of how Syria suffers today. I'd like to open the floor straight away, and as previous moderators have said, it's very hard to see because of the lights here, so please raise your hand vigorously. I see one here.
Lazar Maricevic, Center for Development of Serbia. Well, I don't know which question you didn't raise here. I mean, all the issues that we are facing in challenges to democracy and security have been raised here. But I would like to ask for 3 questions. Firstly, about the economic crisis and the crisis of euro. Do we have, for the first time in history, a larger political debate of all the actors and great powers and globally looking at the point that are discussing the issue, if we are looking at the crisis of euro? That wasn't the case previously. Secondly, do we have beneath all the conflicts maybe, and do we have a struggle for or a fight for the redistribution of power, power, resources and wealth in the world? And finally, maybe that's the question that Mr. Lani asked, do we raise deliberately or not the great expectations of democracy and freedom regarding the liberal capitalism or liberal economy? That's it.
Thank you, Lazar. I'm going to collect some questions. Anyone else? Question here, please.
Svetlana Đurđević-Lukić, Center for Policy Research Studies. So my question would be mostly for Mary, as she used the term Balkanization of Europe as a possibility in future. So if you can elaborate a little bit more. So as we go back, the situation in the Balkans was resolved in the 90s by mostly American military intervention, and then by the European Union soft power in the process of accession. So who will intervene in Europe if we have the Balkanization of Europe? And how it will affect the Balkans? Will we have some reverse effect here, or we will be better than Balkanized Europe?
Is there a third question before we go to the panel? Right there, please.
Hi, my name is Marija Marović. I am from the Balkan Center for the Middle East. I wanted to thank all the panelists for their insightful talks. But my question goes to Mr. Ziadeh. It's a really tragic story of Syria, and I'm really sorry for what your people is suffering there. But my question to you is, can you see the end of Assad? What do you think will bring him down? Will that be a military intervention, or will a Free Syrian Army prevail? Do you maybe see a possible third-party intervention like Turkey, or he will just collapse? That's my first question. And the second question is, given that you are as well the representative of the Syrian opposition, I'm curious to hear, have you ever attempted any negotiations with Russians who might have some leverage over Assad? And have those negotiations, if they ever happened, or have you ever considered an idea of maybe offering Russians some assurances regarding their naval base in Syria as a bargaining chip to sort of soften their support to Assad? Thank you.
Okay, we'll go back to the panel, and I'll start with Marian. Please try and keep your responses succinct so that we can do a second round of questions.
Okay. Are the world leaders discussing the crisis? Of course they are. And, obviously, a few years ago, we would have been completely amazed to hear that the European leaders were talking about euro bonds, were talking about a transaction tax. So they are responding, but always behind the curve, and that's what really worries me. And of course, a key issue is redistribution of income and power. That's key. Over the last 20 years, we've seen a huge increase in inequality. So then there's the question about Balkanization. And you're absolutely right. I mean, when I say Balkanization, what really worries me is the growth of different types of ethno-nationalism. And I think the real problem with contemporary wars is that they're not like the old World War II clashes. Thank goodness they're not as deadly, although they're very deadly, but they are very prolonged. That they involve warring parties who have, in a way, an interest in weak states, in continuing violence, so they can carry on their own activities and become more powerful. And in a way, that continues in the Balkans without the overt violence. But I think this is the kind of thing that I'm thinking of. I don't think we'll have a new world war, but I think we'll have this combination of weak states drawing on what people like to think of as ancient hatreds. I was always very struck in the 1990s when I used to come to the Balkans, and people would say, oh, the Balkans, they've always hated each other. They've always fought each other. And I thought, well, we fought the Germans only 50 years ago. We've always hated the French, us in Britain. So what's the difference? And it's very easy to rekindle those populist sentiments. So who are the outsiders? That is the question. That's the big question. I mean, what I think the role of the outside was less bringing an end. I think, actually, all the way through the Balkan Wars, local leaders manipulated the international community rather than the other way around. But what I do think was that the outsiders managed to maintain the ceasefire. I think at a certain moment when, all the ethnic cleansing was completed, there's an interest in a ceasefire, at least for the time being. And that happens over and over again in wars in Africa and elsewhere. But what the outsiders did was to maintain that ceasefire and to provide aid and to provide all these other things. And that's what's lacking. So it's very grim if that's lacking, unless the European Union can play that role. So my answers aren't very helpful, but there's just one other point I'd quite like to make in relation to the discussion of István. I agree that we're in a moment of great transition. And I think it's not only a post-Westphalian transition, it's also a huge transition in capitalism. And capitalism goes through these great moments of transition throughout its history. The First and Second World War were really part of a grand transition to a mass production consumer age. And at the moment, we're in the midst of a grand transition which has to shift to renewable resources, to energy saving instead of labor saving. And we have to create the institutions for that, which have to be global. And that's the real challenge that I think we're facing at the moment. So I think we are in the midst of a very, very profound transition. And the question is, it's not automatic that you come out of these transitions. It's all about politics.
István?
I want to make 2 points. I agree. I think it's part of the transition. My first point is about the euro crisis, which I think we are pretending that it took us by surprise. It was pretty obvious from the first moment when the euro was conceived that it will get into a deep crisis, because the Maastricht criteria are basically good for nothing. They tell very little about the state of the economy. They were designed for good weather economies of developed countries, the members who were members that time of the European then itself and communities. So the euro was doomed to get into a serious crisis with or without the transition and all the other crises that we are talking about. And of course, it's also due to the fact that the European Union has exercised to the hypocrisy that we pretended that we know, that we believe certain things. We gave into blackmail. We are giving into blackmail, accepting Cyprus as a member, adopting or accepting Greece as a participant in the Eurozone, the name of Macedonia, and I can continue, where we gave into blackmail because we didn't have the guts to say that enough is enough, and we still don't have it, I think, and therefore we are in a deep crisis. Now, whether or not we get out of the crisis will very much depend. Do we continue this hypocrisy, going for solutions of today rather than long-lasting solutions? I think that time only will tell. I still hope that since there is no better game in town than the European Union, and it's good in itself too. So I think we will see. But we must know that the Maastricht criteria basically never did a good job. I give you one example, for instance, it's a basic rule of economy, which even I remember from when I was taught political economy, that if you want to have a GDP growth of X%, you need an inflation of X plus 2%. Now, with 2%, 3% inflation, it's good for a country like Germany or Britain, or is not even in the Eurozone, or France, that time, which showed that 1 to 1.5% GDP growth per year is what they want and what they can achieve. But how can you then expect countries which want to catch up with these countries, even in good weather times, who need to have 4 or 5% GDP growth a year in order to catch up within 40 years or 30 years with 3% inflation? Where do you get the capital when your budget deficit is limited to 3%? Not to mention that budget deficit said nothing about the state of the economy of the country concerned. And of course, when Greece blackmailed itself into the Eurozone, we knew that they were falsifying statistics, but we remained silent. That's my first point. The second point is I feel obliged to, in the Belgrade Security Forum, and due to the big success of my last remarks at this forum on Russia, to make a comment on Russia before we hear the answer from our Syrian friend. The Russian base in Syria or elsewhere in the world is a remainder of the Cold War. Russia has zero use for such bases, for the very simple reason that these bases are meant to support power projection capabilities of the country, which maintains the base. The power projection capability of Russia beyond its neighbors is zero. So it's a prestige base which is good for nothing. Therefore, I don't care if they have a base in Syria or not. So if this is the price, my problem is that Russia cannot be bought by a simple base in Syria. I mean, you see in Serbia that the price Russia is giving to or asking for weak support, not very effective support, is extremely high. So I don't think that and the Russians don't believe in guarantees because their guarantees are good for nothing. Therefore, they don't believe that anybody else's guarantees are good. So, yes, you can negotiate with Russia about the future of the base. I don't think it makes a difference too much. I don't think that it will change Russian politics because the Russian policy vis-à-vis Syria has a very strong basis in Russian internal politics and in international politics. And Syrian opposition, with or without an offer about the base, will not be able to change it.
Ramsey.
Very brief on Syria. It happened that Syria was the first country I visited in my life many years ago. And when I see what's going on in Syria, including in your hometown, which I visited, I ask myself the question that if not in Syria, where and when the responsibility to protect doctrine will be applied and used? I think this is serious. And second, I'm afraid that what happened last 2 weeks in the Arab world will be used as an argument not to intervene in Syria, and this also put me in trouble. Thank you.
Radwan.
Yes, regarding the questions on Russia, I by myself headed to opposition delegation with the Syrian National Council to Moscow in last year in June and in December last year. And we met with the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lavrov. And we said at that time that Russia has to think about its long-term relationship with Syria. Syria has long relationship. Many Syrian academics graduated from Soviet Union universities, and there is many Russian citizens in Syria. And we need to keep such historical relationship. But with the Russian position in supplying the Assad regime day by day, by the way, I collect some trash of the guns and weapons and trying to bring me with Syria, all of them made by Russia. And trying to, I have press conference in the UN next week during, it's all made by Russia. I mean, we've been killed by Russian guns and Russian arms. But I think that the Russians, they see because their position on Libya, and they are losing all their interest in the region. And this is in Syria their last interest, not only because the military base they have in Tartus, but also because Syria became the only market of their arms in the region. And more complicated, it became for me, it's a question for Russian dignity. I mean, this is a Russian domestic politics, because the Russians been accused that they are fellow the Americans and the West in Libya, and they don't want to be to do the same in Syria. This is what raised the question of dignity, especially during the Russian campaign where Putin was strict on this idea. This is a question of dignity, and we will not allow it to happen. And he said that's the resolution 1973, which allowed the Security Council in Libya to take actions to protect the civilians, was a total mistake. They don't want to repeat that. And above all of that, as we know, there is no such a public opinion in Russia. They don't care. If the civilians became raised to 20,000, 25,000, they don't care. There is no such pressure from the media there, from the think tanks or the public opinion on the Russian government to think. And also now which it became a trend that the Russian to repeat the same Syrian government propaganda about the terrorists and about all of that, even that they don't send any of observers. When the UN decided to send 300 observers, we asked the Russians to send observers to collect information, to know. The only country who did not send any observers. The Brazilian they sent, many Latin Americans who their position was reluctant a little bit, when they sent observers and they got the facts on the ground, on the tragedy of the civilians, they changed their position. Now the Brazilian, they called for responsibility to protect and many countries of the civilians in Syria. The second question, I don't see that there is a near end of the crisis in Syria if there is no support from any kind of intervention from outside. Because, of course, the Free Syrian Army was able to capture or to liberate city by cities. But at the end, in Damascus, very difficult. And in many bases, now the two difficult things in Syria, the air force of the Assad regime, which the Assad regime has 29 fighter jets and helicopters. If he decided to use the full capacity of that, can bombard. And the Assad shows that he has ability to use whatever. I met when I was in Syria with an activist. He told me that last year they were discussing that the Assad never will use the air force, because if he uses it, the international community will help us. And now he flew to Turkey. He said that he used it with a large scale and the international community did nothing. Why then still, he told me that I'm 100% sure that the Assad will use chemical weapons, which nothing will change in the position of the international community. And this is why the Syrians, they've been day by day, they lost any hope from the international community to help them. Because yesterday, the figures, the statistics, that the number of the civilians who's been killed in Syria by the Assad force, it's above all the civilians being killed in Libya by both sides during the 7 months operation there. This is why without outside help in imposing the no-fly zone, there is no end. In the history, in 16 countries, they have armed conflict. It never has an end with outside. Only we have the case of Sierra Leone, where the central government was very weak. This is not the case of Syria, where the Assad regime has, regarding the size of the army, is number 16th in the world and number 1 in the Middle East. Of course, now the whole army being divided, but at the Assad regime using more and more on the Alawite community, putting them in figures. I mean, if they list all the pilots, they are Alawites. They don't care if they have brainwashing about what we have. This is a Salafi terrorist and all of that. They can pop out each city. I mean, it's being a city of Aleppo, which called one of the most oldest cities in the world, being bombarded. And we are losing one of the treasures in the city, especially the old city of Aleppo. And we see that the international community and the Assad regime, it doesn't care, can bombard each whatever. This is why I think that with now the inactions, especially with the election in the United States, where the administration, they cannot do anything, and with the economic crisis we talk on Europe, where all the European countries, they reduced the defense budget, no one can take the leadership except the U.S. And the U.S. now in an election year, and I don't think that the Obama administration can take very serious decision in any military intervention or build up a coalition of the willings outside of the Security Council before the election.
Thank you. I'll take a final round of questions. The first one is right here in front, and then over there, and then over there.
Thanks very much. I'm always provoked by pessimists because I want to question the pessimism. I must say I really liked the intervention yesterday by Bruce Jackson when he put our talk about this crisis a little bit in perspective. And I think that the talk of crisis, of the Euro crisis and the European crisis, is very different compared to what country you are in, and not just whether you are hit hard or not. So I think that kind of drawing this very big pessimistic line, I would just like to put it into perspective and ask whether, if we look at the region we are in now, whether the Balkan countries are not drawing, and especially Serbia maybe, are not drawing the wrong conclusions from what is happening in Europe. And I think they are. And I think that, therefore, the conclusion that we have no solution may be a little too fast. Because I do think that there are different reactions as to where countries are in their development. And the empowerment of young people, for instance, whether you as a young person are brought up by your parents to take your own responsibility, to create your own opportunities, a little bit like the American dream of the woodchopper who becomes president or whatever. That kind of empowerment of young people, of course, will move people in a different direction than those young people who are brought up by their parents, by society, to think that society is providing all the solutions. And this, of course, is not something where you can just say this is one size fits all for Europe. It's very much one size that fits for whatever background the individual countries has. And I think that, of course, we have an economic crisis. And, of course, that's a huge challenge. Of course, in many countries, it's a huge challenge also for the way that our democratic governments are doing that, how much populism we allow in, we voters allow to be voted in parliament. But it's a different size to different countries. And I don't think that the crisis in Europe is so profound as to some of the conclusions that you sometimes find in the Western Balkans, saying that, well, maybe we shouldn't go so much this way, maybe we should look to other sides, maybe there are no solution, maybe it's a wrong time for us to move in that direction. I think that's a really wrong conclusion to draw. And I think, of course, it's bad at the moment, but on the other hand, I do not subscribe to this kind of everything is dark and it's pessimistic, there are no solutions.
Let's go back there.
Nemanja Starović, BFP alumnus. I have one question for Ambassador Gyarmati. Well, you said that you believe that Huntington's vision is going to prevail over Fukuyama in the future, and that you believe that some kind of, let's say, clash or tensions between the pre-modern and post-modern societies in the world are inevitable in the future. So since you come from Hungary and you are a good neighbor to our region of the Balkans and have very good insights on our whereabouts, do you believe that our peninsula will be the stage of some major events in the decades to come, or just a backstage? Thank you.
Okay, and finally here.
My name is Čedo Rajačić, editor-in-chief of Army Info Forum. I'm very surprised because I heard here lots of stuff which I don't think it is true. First, for Ambassador István, Russia projection of force in Syria and its base, you said that it is zero. That is not true, because Russia very used that base in Tartus because he put there its aircraft carrier and lots of other ships, military ships, which simply patrol on the water near Syria and stop illegal trafficking of armaments, etc., and other stuff. For Mr. from Syria, I'm interested, where is the proofs of all that? You mentioned that Russia didn't send not advisors, but people who look and check whatever happening in Syria. But Russia have a military command with Syria. Russia also have several hundred people in its base, and also have several very big installation for seeing and radar installation, etc. I don't think that lots of stuff you mentioned are true, because there is no proof for that. Not only that there is no proof for that, but also few, and there is much more countries simply don't recognize that. All those you mentioned are kind of Western politics and demagogy, etc., etc. Because for me, the Syrian Liberation Army is kind of on Serbian, that is OVK, that is Freedom Kosovo Liberation Army. That is the very same terrorist organization also. Thanks.
Final round for the panel. Mary, start us off.
First, pessimism. I mean, I certainly think the answer to the crisis is more Europe, not less. And that should be the lesson in the Balkans as well as everywhere else. My pessimism arises from the fact that I don't think at the moment there's a political constituency for more Europe. And that's why I'm very worried about the future. And I think, you know, these austerity policies have only just begun to bite. And I think as we see the effects over a long period of these very tight austerity policies, the situation is going to get much worse. That's why I'm pessimistic. Secondly, I'd like to say something about the clash of civilizations, because my feeling is this is not a clash of civilizations. We live in a globalized world. There's a clash of civilizations within civilizations. There are people in Pakistan protesting Islam, but there are others who maybe are Islamic or maybe are secular, but nevertheless favor democracy. And the crisis is going on within each society. And, you know, there's a real need for, if you like, a cosmopolitan international. That's where the clash of civilization is happening. Whereas kind of Huntington's idea was the Islamic world against I don't think it's that at all. I think it's the fundamentalists versus the liberals. And then finally, I'd like to say something about Syria and responsibility to protect, because I do think, I agree very much with Ramsey that this is a case for responsibility to protect. But I do think there's always been a problem of responsibility to protect, because it was always about the responsibility of outside powers to protect, rather than the rights of the victims to be protected. And for me, what human security is about is the right to be protected, which is rather different from the responsibility of outside powers. And I think the cases both of Kosovo and Libya illustrated some of the problems of the way responsibility to protect is conceived. Because somehow there's a mismatch. You want to protect people, but you can use classic military forces which involved a very high level of killing. And so what you saw in Libya, for example, was that while it was a very good thing to stop those Gaddafi forces from attacking Benghazi, the West got involved in a war in which they were on the side of the rebels. Now, I'm very glad the rebels won, but nevertheless, that involved a lot of casualties. And when you win a war, rather than having political, peaceful change, the guys with the guns, who are often not most important politically, most useful or constructive politically, become more powerful. And actually that's what happened in Kosovo too. NATO enormously increased the power of the KLA versus others politically. So the question is, how can we rethink responsibility to protect? And if we can't rethink it in Syria, then the whole concept is done. So, I think we need another longer discussion with Radwan, which I would like to engage in after this, about what we can do. Your story reminded me very much of Tuzla, actually. And I remember we had a big intervention from NGOs, from local municipalities through Europe to help support the Tuzla experiment. And I think we need to do more of that in the liberated areas. And maybe we also need a no-fly zone, but these things should be brought together.
István.
I think there are two scenarios for Europe, as I said. And my preferred scenario, which I think is still more likely, like 51-49 at least, maybe even more, is more Europe. What I'm saying is that more Europe doesn't mean that it will stop the decline of Europe. It will slow down and ensure a smooth landing, but it will not stop the decline. So I think we will have to accept, not complaining that the Americans are turning to Asia, etc., which I think is a good saying, actually. But accept that our role will be much more limited, but it will be even more limited or non-existent if we don't create a unified Europe. So what I said, Matt, about my pessimism was not about Europe, it was about the world. I think that the problems in the world cannot be solved. In Europe, they can be solved. For instance, reviewing the Maastricht criteria, making them more realistic, etc., and basically going ahead with European integration. And I see good reasons and also good chances for that. Secondly, Syria. I think, Mary, that you mentioned the responsibility to protect and the right to be protected. It's two sides of the same coin. And I think what we have now is the need to be protected and the right to be protected by the people of Syria. But we don't live up to our responsibility, which was actually taken voluntarily at some point. But as in many other cases, we don't take our own obligations, our own promises very seriously. And I think some people in the back of their minds are extremely happy that there is Russia and China, because there is an excuse not to do it. The Russian base in Syria, first of all, Russia doesn't have an aircraft carrier, so they couldn't station aircraft carriers in Syria. But the very limited role that the Russian ships 2 or 3 play actually in a NATO operation in the eastern basin of the Mediterranean can be done without a base. You don't need a base and hundreds of people stationed there to have a 2-ship operation in the Mediterranean. If you need a base, that exactly shows that you don't have power projection capability, because a fleet has to have a sustainable operation without bases. I think what is important in this respect that we see that while the West is very limited in helping the liberation of Syria from a dictator, Russia is very actively supporting the dictator by weapons and by personnel. And I can understand that sometimes we are very afraid to shoot down, or we would be very afraid to shoot down planes, MiG-23s or ones of Russia, because we don't know who the pilots are, of what nationality the pilots are. So I think it's a very difficult choice, but we have to make the choice. Finally, I don't want to mix Kosovo in this, but I just want to recall that liberations always started by terrorists. George Washington was a terrorist for the Brits, and now he is one of the biggest heroes of world history. Menahem Begin was a terrorist again for the Brits, and they created the State of Israel and became statesmen. So I think I'd be very careful with these parallels. In general, of course, we have a serious problem, because on the surface, it's very difficult to see the difference between guerrillas and terrorists. And I think what's happening in Syria for the time being has nothing to do with terrorism. It is a guerrilla war. Sorry? So it's a guerrilla war. The methods are similar to some extent, but they are not terrorists. They might become. If the West still doesn't help, it will mean that others will. And those who are already helping and will help will try to create a system after the fall of Assad, which will be much less to our liking and to the, more importantly, to the interests of the Syrian people than the one which I think we still didn't miss the chance to support. Because I think for the time being, what's happening in Syria, it's a kind of a revolution, and it's not only the responsibility to protect, but also our good interests and our values that would oblige us to help, because this is one of the really rare cases in today's world where core values and interests 100% coincide.
Ramsey? Okay. Radwan,
yes.
Final word.
I think it's regarding the responsibility to protect. Always there have been questions who's the countries or can issue or take care of the responsibility of the protect. In Libya, as example, we know that in any prolonged crisis, the consequences of that much bigger than if we take actions before. If we look to the number of the civilians who has been killed by the NATO operations in Libya, is very limited. And most of the casualties or most of the individuals being killed by the fight between the two sides. And this is clear. Now I think that if the international community imposed the no-fly zone in Syria, I don't think that the crisis will last more than 2 or 3 months. It's clear the Assad army exhausted, a defection day by day, with the same time strength of the Free Syrian Army. If we did not take any actions, look that the number of casualties increasing dramatically, the presence of the Islamist or the extremist can hijack, as we've seen for instance in Benghazi in Libya. And yesterday the population of Benghazi demonstrated against those groups. And this is why the consequences of that. And we'll end here by the regional and international implications of the inactions in Syria on the international community. Syria, it's in the middle of a regional where it's the only country who connected to the countries who have previous civil war. It's Syria connected to Lebanon, connected to Iraq, and Jordan, which under fire because of the Palestinian-Jordanian issue, and of course connected to the Arab-Israeli conflict in Israel and in Palestine. And that makes, if the inactions from the international community, of course the crisis in Syria will spill over. We already seen that in Lebanon. We already seen that in other areas. This is why the actions to end the crisis, in many cases, without sometimes taking decisions, very serious and difficult decisions, but at the time it's really unimportant, and this is the issue. Regarding Russia, and this is the argument we make to the all EU and Western officials, because always they now, the United States as example, they spent the last 6 months on called the shaming Russian policy in Syria. With the comments of Secretary Clinton in the Friends of Syria conference in Paris, when she said that Russia has to pay prices for its position on Syria. then the United States realized that this policy shaming Russia will not work. And because it's not realistic that to ask the Russians who are supplying and arming the Syrian regime day by day, to ask them to take actions against the Assad regime in the Security Council. It's not realistic to ask who are supplying, then the same day you ask to help to take actions against the Assad regime. All the options in Syria have been exhausted. We have negotiations, we have tried diplomacy, we have tried sanctions, we have tried to have regional conversation and negotiations, but none of this work. And this is sometimes you have to take serious decisions. For me, of course, it's not the better one to have military intervention from outside, but we are running out of options. And I think without imposing the no-fly zone to end the crisis soon and to end the tragedies of the casualties in Syria, we'll hear more and more stories. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of you who have participated in the debate, and please join me in thanking our panel.